The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures.
He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul.
He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake.
Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me.
Your rod and your staff, they comfort me.
You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies.
You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows.
Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life.
And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
We've spent the past few weeks kind of looking through Psalm 23 together and thinking about this abundant life that Jesus offers us, this abundant life, this life and life to the full, this life without lack that Jesus offers us. And we've been going verse by verse through Psalm 23. And this morning we're going to be looking at verse 5 specifically, just the first half of verse 5, which says that you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Just you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. And you'll notice if you've been, as Kathy read the whole psalm earlier, or in that version of the psalm, you'll notice that David begins to mix his metaphors here, okay, which is something you're not supposed to do. But David starts the first 4 verses of Psalm 23. Am I allowed to say that David did something he's not supposed to do? Is that bad? Is that sacrilegious? Hopefully, I don't know. Bill will tell me later if I did something bad. But in the first 4 verses, what you get from David is this example, this metaphor of sheep and shepherd. This idea of the shepherd who's leading the sheep beside still waters through these green pastures. And then in verse 5, he switches the metaphor, right? Because sheep don't sit at tables and sheep don't have enemies. And so he switches the metaphor, but the relationship remains the same. He goes from talking about the shepherd as the provider for the sheep to God as the provider for himself. And he makes it really explicit, this image of God as provider. And so you can just picture this shepherd who loves his sheep, is a provider for his sheep, and then this God who loves his people, who loves David, who loves us, who is an overwhelmingly generous, loving, compassionate provider in our lives, who prepares a table for David, even in the presence of his enemies. And so as we think this morning about what it means for God to prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies, I just ask, will you just join me in prayer and we can dive in this morning? Heavenly Father, God, we just pray this morning that you would give us a vision of what your table looks like in our lives. What it looks like for us to find this table that you are preparing for us, God, even in the presence of our enemies, that this morning you would allow us to hear your voice calling out to us in new ways and inviting us into this abundant life. And we pray these things in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen. I'm a firm believer right now that one of the greatest challenges, if not the greatest challenge of being a follower of Jesus in America today, is that we don't need God to be our provider, right? For most of us, we don't need God to be the provider in our lives. And that's probably not unique to America, right? If you look back at followers of Jesus throughout history in any sort of major economic power or geopolitical power, they probably dealt with the same problems. In fact, we see it time and time throughout history. But what I know for certain is that most of us, not all of us, but most of us don't feel like we need God to be our provider. We don't need God to be our provider in our everyday lives. I once heard a pastor say it this way. He said it a little differently. I'll give you the gist of it. But he said more or less that the most common prayer in America today isn't that God would bless us because we don't need God to bless us. It's that God would send something to hell that we want to be sent to hell, right? And you can just imagine what that prayer goes like, right? When you're doing some housework and you hammer your thumb, right? You say a quick little prayer that I won't repeat because everyone's around and but you say that quick little prayer to God when you're frustrated, when you're mad. And the same is true in all sorts of ways. When you hit your thumb with the hammer, you turn to that prayer, but when you need to pay for a vacation, you do it you turn to your savings account. When you get into an argument with your kids, you turn really quickly to that 1 second prayer. But when you have to figure out what it looks like to parent your kids, you turn to books and to radio shows. When you find yourself making a wrong turn or getting lost, you turn to God with that prayer, right? Or for a lot of us, when your husband makes a wrong turn and gets you lost, you find yourself turning to God very quickly with that prayer. But when it comes time to figure out how to get back on track, you pull out your phone and you search how to get to your destination. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things, right? I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with turning to your phone when you're lost, opening up Google Maps. There's nothing wrong with getting parenting advice from the books that people recommend to you. There's nothing wrong with paying for your vacation out of your savings account. But all I'm saying is that for most of the history of the church, those were the sorts of things that you used to need God to provide in your life. And we don't. For most of us, we don't need God to provide those things in our lives. And what Psalm 23 shows us both in the first 4 verses in the sheep and shepherd metaphor, but here also is that God is the provider of our abundant lives. God is the provider of our abundant lives. When we experience the abundant life, this life and life to the full, which Jesus offers us, God will be our provider. God will be the one who provides it. By definition, the abundant life is the life that God provides. That's what it means for it to be the abundant life. And all too often, our sort of personal vision of what the abundant life looks like is a life that we can earn for ourselves. Rather than being a life that God provides for us, we focus in on things, a life that we can earn and achieve for ourselves. When we think about the abundant life, we often picture things like things we can accomplish, like getting a job promotion, or starting a business, or having a big family, or getting into the right college, or buying the perfect house. And the list goes on and on and on. And the way we respond to those things, we want those things, is to say, okay, here's what you do. You're going to put your head down. You're going to put your hours in. You're going to put your hand to the metaphorical plow, and eventually you will get those things, right? You're going to pull yourselves up by your bootstrap, and then you will have those things that will make your life feel like an abundant life, your own vision, your own version of this abundant life. But what I think is interesting is that in almost every case, maybe even every case, I'm tempted to say every case, but I don't want someone to find the one case where it's not true. So if you can, go for it. But in almost every case, when Jesus invites someone into the abundant life, it looks completely the opposite of that. When Jesus invites someone into this abundant life, it looks completely the opposite of putting your head down, of doing the work, of putting your hand to the plow. When Jesus invited Peter into the abundant life, he told him to leave behind his nets. When Jesus invited Matthew into the abundant life, he told him to leave behind the tax collector's booth. When Jesus invited the rich young ruler into the abundant life, he told him to leave behind his wealth. And David's table in Psalm 23 gives us a glimpse of that. And if you're one of those people who studiously takes notes this morning, I want you can kind of leave this as a header. We're going to have 3 sections this morning, kind of looking at these 3 different tables that we see. And the first is David's table. We can see here at David's table the beginnings of what this looks like. Because just like in the cases of Peter or Matthew or the rich young ruler, David had a way of trying to secure his vision of the abundant life. He had a way of trying to secure for himself the life that he wanted and the life that he desired. Right? David was a powerful king, and not just any powerful king. He was a warrior king. You can look throughout almost any history of the ancient Mesopotamian world, and they'll tell you the same thing. David was Israel's most successful conqueror. Whether that's a biblical scholar or someone who studies just the ancient Near East historically, they'll tell you David was Israel's most successful conqueror. Up until this point in Israel's history, they have had almost no real success on the battlefield, and David changes all that. He expands Israel's kingdom to reaches it never had before. He provides security. He unites the kingdom on his own or for himself for the first time. He conquers Jerusalem and makes it David's city. There's a song even the people of Israel sing about David that we see in 1 Samuel, right? That Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Okay, imagine that in a worship song. We can all just sing that Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. So there's a picture of how David was capable of securing his own vision of the life he wanted, his own vision of the abundant life, not with a plow or with a net or with a tax collector's booth, but with the sword. By raising his sword in battle against enemies and defeating them. That's what David did. That was his overwhelming strategy. But notice how God offers the abundant life to David. It's that he prepares a table for him in the presence of his enemies. In the presence of his enemies. That is the exact opposite of David's usual strategy. His usual strategy, right? First defeat his enemy, whether that enemy is Goliath or the Philistines or the Jebusites or whatever other group David defeated. Because there's a lot of them. There's entire books of the Bible that are committed to just here's who David defeated and how he did it. And yet here in this moment, the abundant life is offered to him in the presence of his enemies. You can almost picture David's enemies lined up right around the room, kind of around the edge of the room, just watching him sit at this table and feast at this table which God has provided him. What we see is that David can sit at the table. He can accept this abundant life. He can embrace this abundant life because he knows that the abundant life requires faith in the provider. Finding the abundant life requires you to have faith in the provider, faith that God is preparing a table for you to sit at, even in the presence of your enemies, even in uncomfortable situations, even in places we don't want to be in. And that's not our first natural impulse. I'm sure if you ask Peter how to find the abundant life the day before Jesus shows up on the scene, my guess is that Peter wouldn't have said, I should leave my nets and do something else. If you would have asked Matthew the same question, I doubt he would have said, I should leave my tax collector's booth and find something else and do something else. I know for a fact if you asked the rich young ruler that question, he wouldn't have said, I should leave behind my wealth, because in the end, he chose not to. But when the time came, at least in the cases of David and Peter and Matthew, and Jesus invited them to sit at the table he had provided for them, he had prepared for them to experience this abundant life he had designed for them, they had faith in their provider. That even without their nets and even without their tax booth and even without first defeating their enemies, that God would provide for them. They had the faith that the table that God provided for them was better than the table they could provide for themselves. The faith that the abundant life that God was offering them was better than the life they could provide for themselves. And in part, I think, and this is our challenge, is that in part, I think that faith came from seeing that sitting at the table can provide for real needs. Sitting at the table can provide for your real needs. For David and for Peter and for Matthew, they saw that. Peter and Matthew saw Jesus provide for their real needs miraculously time and time again. When they were on the boat and the storm was growing and they thought they were going to drown, Jesus met their real need by calming the storm. When they were in a crowd of people that had no food and was way too large, they watched Jesus provide for their real needs right there in front of them by producing food, by performing a miracle and feeding more than 5,000 people right in front of them. David saw how placing his faith in God and sitting at the table led him to be able to do things. He was provided the ability to do things like defeat Goliath and survive Saul hunting him down, chasing him down. They saw the way that the table which God was offering them met their real needs. But how often do we need God to provide for our real needs? How often do we need God to provide for the real needs that we have in our life? How often are we willing to let God be the one who provides rather than us doing the extra work of providing? I know for myself, the answer to that question is not that often, right? Matthew and Peter and David, they relied on God constantly for all sorts of things in their life. For me, I think that's less true. I very rarely need God to provide for my everyday life. It's a blessing, I think, for myself, but it also is a challenge because I don't have to have the same reliance on God, or at least it doesn't feel like I have to have the same reliance on God each and every day that David did, or Matthew or Peter did. And I should note, right, this idea that we rely on God, we should find our daily needs met by God. This isn't an encouragement to laziness, right? This isn't an encouragement to just standing around and waiting for God to provide for our daily needs, right? The Apostle Paul kind of has a really interesting account at the end of 2 Thessalonians about this, because the church in Thessalonica, he's been there, wrote some letters there, then it happens again. They're standing around literally waiting for Jesus to return, because Paul has talked about how Jesus would be coming soon. The church was talking about how Jesus would be coming soon, and the Thessalonians took that very, very literally. And a group of people in the church, they start going and standing out and sitting out in these fields just waiting for Jesus to return. And now 2,000 years after that, we can look back and say they would have been there a long time, right? And so in 2 Thessalonians, Paul writes to them and he basically says, go back. Get out of the field and go back to work. Go back to your families. Go back to your homes, because there's work still to be done. Waiting for God to provide for us doesn't look like just sitting around and doing nothing and just trusting that in a moment God will meet our needs and our desires and fulfill our daily needs like this. With the high school students, on Wednesday, we talked about the parable of the talents, where Jesus gives 5 talents to one servant, 2 talents to another, and 1 to another. And the one who receives 5 and the one who received 2, they go and they double it. And God says to them, well done, my good and faithful servant. And the one who he's given 1 talent to buries it in the field, knowing that he will come back. And God says to him, you wicked, lazy servant. Obviously, the invitation is not to do nothing, but the invitation is to find that we are having our needs met by sitting at the table. And that's a little bit of a challenge. That's a little bit of a challenge to figure out. That's a fine line to walk. And I really wish I had an answer for us when we asked ourselves, okay, is what I'm doing sitting at the table, or is what I'm doing trying to secure this vision of the life I want for myself? I wish there was a really clear answer. I wish there was a way to say yes and no, just here's a hard and fast rule. But I don't have that. There's a pastor, his name's Andy Stanley, and he says this often. He says that there are tensions to be lived in, and there are problems to be solved. And when we get into trouble is when we live in the problems and we try to solve the tensions. And I think, I don't know, the street racing going on is a problem, not a tension that needs to be lived in, I think. But the idea, I think, here is this, is that when it comes to figuring out whether or not we're sitting at the table or whether or not we are trying to earn this life for ourselves, that is a tension we're going to have to live in. That's a tension we're going to have to live in and day out, to be willing to ask ourselves, am I trying to earn something for myself, or am I relying on God to provide? And we'll have to come to that question again and again and again. It's not going to be something that we can just solve in an instant. But I do think that Jesus gives us an example, gives us a model that will help us build that confidence, build that faith, will help us have opportunities to rely on him. And he gives us this example in John chapter 13, if you want to turn there with me. And in John chapter 13, we see Jesus's table, right? David is offered a table in Psalm 23, and in John 13, Jesus offers us a different table. Maybe it's the same one in just a slightly different way. And we see in the story some of the last moments that Jesus spends with his disciples. It says this, it was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around them. So, right, we see the disciples here. They're sitting at this table to have their Passover meal, and they're all sitting together. And it's important to note, right, in ancient Israel, sitting at the table did not mean sitting in chairs. Right? It wasn't like this. It wasn't like we eat dinner. It meant reclining together on these little low kind of sofas, and you would put your feet up and kind of rest next to the table. And in the ancient world, when you walked around everywhere and you wore sandals everywhere and you walked on dirt roads and people led their donkeys along these roads, there was a real challenge there because you've got your feet. And if any of you are the kinds of people who wear sandals all summer, right? At the end of the day, you get home and your feet are disgusting, right? My wife tells me my feet are disgusting every time I wear sandals because it's true. But this is the thing. They're all sitting there, and they all are reclining, and they've got their feet unwashed by the table. And Jesus stops, and he meets a real need for them. They need to have their feet washed. That's a real need. You can't just sit and eat dinner with someone's dirty feet hanging out in your face. And Jesus stops, and he meets this real need, and he meets this real need with Judas at the table. He knows what's about to happen. He knows that Judas is about to betray him. And he washes their feet. The story goes on. It says, he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Jesus replied, you do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, unless I wash you, then you have no part with me. Then Lord, Simon Peter replied, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Here's what we see at Jesus' table, is that at David's table, he sat and he ate in the presence of his enemies, but Jesus invited his enemies to the table. Jesus invited Judas to the table, and he washed his feet, and he met his real need. Jesus invited Peter to the table, knowing that in just a few hours from this point, Peter would deny knowing who he even was. And yet he washed his feet, and he met his real need. And then he gives the command, right, to do these things as he has done them for us. Here's how we have an opportunity to have Jesus meet our real needs. To rely on Jesus to meet our real needs is to be the kinds of people who do what Jesus has invited us to do. To be the kinds of people who bless and serve others the way that Jesus has blessed and served us. Dallas Willard puts it this way. He says that having been served, we are free to serve. Having been invited to the table by Jesus, we are free then to invite others to the table. We are free to meet their real needs, to help them have confidence and faith in the provider. And there's no promise that sitting at the table will ultimately be cheap, right? There's no promise that it won't cost you something. For Jesus, sitting at that table cost him his life. It also went on to cost 10 of the apostles their lives. But by sitting at the table, the apostles found the abundant life. They found the life without lack. They found life and life to the full. And this morning, the reality is that God is preparing a table for you. He's preparing a table for you in the presence of your enemies. He's preparing a table for you in all the situations you find yourself in. He's inviting you to the table. And so as we close this morning, I want to just give us two questions to think about. And the first is this: have you pulled up your seat to the table? Have you pulled up your seat to the table that God is inviting you to? For some of us, the answer is probably yes. I've pulled up my seat to the table. I've said I want to experience this abundant life. I want to have faith in my provider. I want to have faith that the provider will be good for me. But for others of us, the reality is we're trying to defeat our enemies before we sit down at the table. We're trying to secure the vision of the life that we want before we're willing to sit down and trust that God will provide for us. And if that's you this morning, I just want to invite you to take this time to come to the table, to sit at the table and experience what God has for you. To come as you are. You don't have to defeat your enemies first. You don't have to overcome your struggles first. You don't have to deal with your addictions first. You don't have to handle any situation in your life first. The invitation first is to come to the table. To sit at the table and see that God is good, that he loves you, that he cares for you, that he is providing for you. But for others of you this morning, for others of us this morning, the question you need to be asking is who do you need to invite to the table this week? Who do you need to invite to your table this week? Because the table's not just for you. As much as we want it to be, as much as we want it to be about our abundant life and our having the things we want and our hopes and our desires, Jesus has called us to do as he did, to invite even our enemies to the table. To bring an opportunity for our enemies, the people that we might not even want at the table with us, to sit with us, to experience the goodness and the provision of God with us. And so this morning, I want to just give you an opportunity to think about, who do you need to invite to your table this week? Who are the people in your life? Maybe they're people that you've been a part of your 8 to 15 list for a long time. Maybe they're people you work with. Maybe they're people you go to school with. Maybe they're people you wish you didn't have to interact with so often. But who do you need to invite to the table this week? So as we close out our service this morning in worship together, I just want to invite you to think, have you pulled up your seat to the table? Because if not, this morning is an opportunity to come as you are to the table. And if you have, who do you need to invite to your table this week? Let's worship the God who provides for us together.